You can't look at trade agreements without looking at the influence of multinational corporations within global policy formation. So that's the angle I'm coming at this issue at. So if you're a powerful enough actor, such as the United States government or the major pharmaceutical industry, you have resources at your disposal to look around for the forums that are best going to be amenable for what you need and what you want to get out of negotiating. And you can potentially even construct one if there's not already one existing. Now, intellectual property governance over the last 40 years is a really good example of forum shifting and forum shopping. So to tell a little bit of the story of this, because the TPP is the final chapter, or the latest chapter, is where we're at now in the story. So let's have a look at this. Let's quickly get ready for 30 to 40 years of IP global governance. I'm sure that's probably not why you came here today, but that's what's going to happen for the next 5 minutes. Okay, patents. Patents are a cornerstone of intellectual property, and they are the legal protection for the right to make profit on an invention or discovery. Some people, in fact most people, refer to these as part of intellectual property. Others argue that they don't actually protect property. What they actually protect are monopolies, because a patent grants you a monopoly. Now, perhaps then, rather than intellectual property protection, maybe a more accurate name might be market monopoly protection, and that's just something to bear in mind. When patents were created around 500 years ago, they were granted by the king or the queen to ensure the exclusive right for a certain trade to practice its business. They were privileges conferred upon preferred subjects of the sovereign. And as such, they were regarded by commentators as highly protectionist, as a tool for protectionism. In fact, in the 19th century in England, there was a vigorous anti-patent campaign led by some of the captains of industry, some of the biggest advocates of free trade, including the Economist magazine, which many of you will be aware is a bastion of free trade and free trade ideas, became outspoken critics of the patent system. Their argument was that it was anti-free trade, protectionist, and a dangerous regulatory distortion to free market capitalism. Patent protection, though, survived this attack on it, and it became institutionally regulated through a couple of conventions, the Berne Convention and the Paris Convention, which then became combined into the UN organization, so at the United Nations, called the World Intellectual Property Organization. Now, by the 1970s, many of those industries who had previously been against patent protection were now some of its strongest advocates. And here we had one of our first major conflicts over intellectual property protection. And Big Pharma was one of the biggest champions at this stage. Now, the major pharmaceutical industry, Big Pharma in particular, became a champion of stronger patent protection because from their point of view, the monopolies that patents protected were necessary to recoup the costs of research and development. It's very expensive to develop medicines, therefore you need to get the rents in order to do that development. Now, in the 1970s, though, a group of developing countries at the United Nations argued the opposite. And they said that these patent protections were making it near impossible for them to access the medicines they needed to treat various third world diseases that were befalling them. From their point of view, these patents were too strong and were impeding access to medicines, and therefore why would they sign up at the UN to further increase patent protection? So this group of developing countries organised under the banner of the G77, the group of 77, and they protested at the UN against what Big Pharma was trying to do. And because the UN's relatively democratic, they each had an equal vote, this group of 77 built a lot of power behind them, and it meant that the UN was a very unlikely place for big pharmaceutical companies to be able to strengthen patent protection. So what did big pharmaceuticals do? They said, let's get out of the UN, let's forum shift. If we can't get what we want here, let's find somewhere where we can get it. So they looked around for where they could get it, and what they started was called the GATT strategy. If anyone's heard of GATT, it's the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It was the place at the time where you could negotiate trade agreements. And big pharmaceutical companies, led by a company called Pfizer, who at the time was led by a man called Edmund Pratt, had this visionary idea that if we take intellectual property protection and connect it, we integrate it with the trade agenda, with trade agreements, then we can convince these developing countries to sign up to higher patent protections because we can give them all sorts of concessions on trade at the same time. It'd be a package deal. It's called linkage bargaining. And they thought, this is a great idea. The only problem was no one else agreed with them. everyone else said, that's a crazy idea. Why would we want to work so hard on patent protection? We've already got the World Intellectual Property Organization. We're already doing this at the UN. Why do we need to do this with trade? This wasn't going to stop Pfizer. It wasn't going to stop Edmund Pratt. So they launched a 20-year initiative, what's now regarded as one of the most successful incidents of corporate activism the world's seen in recent years, where first of all they built an alliance transnationally to believe in this idea that they needed to support stronger patents. And then they managed to integrate this into the trade agreement. And this was successful. In 1995, the World Trade Organization was formed, and intellectual property was one of its 3 fundamental pillars through what's called the TRIPS agreement, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. This was considered to be a major revolution in global intellectual property protection and global intellectual property regulation. It was also considered to be a major coup by special interests in the pharmaceutical industry, and one rare example, well, one of the finest examples of specialist corporate interests influencing global policy making. When I say it like that, it sounds really easy. Believe me, it wasn't easy at all. It required well, I hate to think of the resources spent internationally just lobbying governments for this, but also discursively, rhetorically, this involved creating a new way of thinking about patents. And that was kind of factored around 2 things. One was identifying the enemy to patents from a pharmaceutical point of view was generic medicines. This involved constructing generics as piracy, which was called the piracy rhetorical scheme. And it involved implementing the idea that patent protection itself creates more innovation, that it's fundamental for innovation, that it's necessary for innovation. These 2 ideas formed the cornerstone of the Big Pharma plan, and you can all see them now well integrated within the common sense discourse of many policymakers today, in the world today. Although I would point out that there is a growing body of research that completely disproves both of these claims. If anyone's interested in that, I'd be happy to talk about that more. But then what happened? We're going on the story of forum shifting. What happened was that by about 2001, you had this stronger patent protection like the world had never seen through the World Trade Organization. Big pharmaceutical companies reaped the benefits of it. They were always good business. They had been good business since developing out of chemical companies in the 19th century. But by 2001, big pharmaceutical companies were the most profitable industry the world had ever seen. In 2001, have you all heard of the Fortune 500? In the Fortune 500 in 2001, the top 10 pharmaceutical companies made more profit than all other 490 companies combined. And if you can understand that statistic, you can understand how big this industry we're talking about is, and think of the profits used there and how many of them were channeled back into lobbying. What happened though, around the same time, was that a group of developing countries again, but more particularly a transnational group of civil society activists, led by groups such as Oxfam, led by Medicine Sans Frontiers, the Treatment Action Campaign, Health Action International, started to promote the idea that these stronger intellectual property rules were impeding access to medicines in developing countries. They rallied around the idea of global AIDS because AIDS had become so prevalent at the time that it created a high publicity opportunity to publicise the negative impact of patent protection on medicines access. Now this campaign was so successful. In fact, if you think about how successful the corporate activist campaign was to strengthen intellectual property rights, this is kind of its equivalent on the activist side. It was a successful transnational campaign to critique this patent strengthening. And they won certain concessions. So the WTO adopted a new declaration called the Doha Declaration that clarified the right of countries to access generic medicines. On the back of this, major funders started to buy generic AIDS medicines, and millions more people are alive today who wouldn't have been otherwise, who couldn't access these medicines because they got cheaper generic copies of antiretroviral AIDS medicines. Major success for the activist campaign. So what did Big Pharma do? Well, they'd spent 20 years and numerous resources trying to strengthen intellectual property in the WTO, and now suddenly people are using the WTO to access generic medicines, to access piracy. So just as forum shifting had worked for them in the past, they did it again. This time they forum shifted from the WTO to bilateral and regional free trade agreements. Free trade agreements either between one country in the United States or free trade agreements between many countries in the United States. And that's what the TPP is. That brings us to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. It's one of many free trade agreements that have come after the formation of the WTO in the last 15 years. And each of these agreements, I think the United States has signed about 17 of these with different countries. Each of them increases patent protection beyond what the WTO prescribes. So where the WTO is called the TRIPS agreement, these free trade agreements are called TRIPS Plus. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is a very good example of the TRIPS Plus agreement. So that's why we have this TPP before us now. I would just like to sort of emphasize here that I'm telling one story that's gone through this line, one story of the pharmaceutical industry. It's not the only story of why these agreements exist, but I think given that Big Pharma is one of the biggest lobby groups pushing this agenda, and given that what we've seen from the IP chapter being leaked, how important the stronger patent protection measures in the TPP are to big pharmaceutical companies and to the US, it's pretty clear that this common line has been one of the guiding influences of bringing us to the TPP. So, why should we care about this? What does this even mean for us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement? We don't have a major AIDS epidemic. We don't have a major malaria or tuberculosis epidemic. We may have a burgeoning obesity, smoking, drinking, diabetes, cancer epidemic, but we'll just have to wait to see how these develop. But in general, we're a developed country, we're a rich country, so why should this be of concern to us? And I think that is the big question, right? That's the question that it's great to have a forum like this to debate. And it's the question that I think as a nation we need to be asking, do we need these stronger patent protections? And what do they serve for us? Now you would have heard, if you're reading the papers, a lot of the arguments about what they serve for us, greater innovation, etc. We don't have an innovative pharmaceutical industry, so that's not a question. But we do have a need for access to medicines, and we do have what's called Pharmac, which, amongst other things, has been very good at negotiating cheaper prices on medicines, often by either buying generics or using the threat of buying generics as a negotiating tool to bring down the price on brand name medicines. It's a very effective negotiating tool if you can say to the big pharmaceutical companies, we're not going to pay your prices when we can get it cheaper elsewhere. It's a very good tool for ensuring you might get a discount. So Pharmac has been internationally recognised as being very good for this. And I think from my perspective, that should make us concerned about a couple of aspects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. One of these is that, as we've seen through the WTO's TRIPS agreement, through the numerous TRIPS Plus agreements and their implementation in various countries, higher IP protection, higher patent protection leads to higher medicines prices. Not in and of itself per se, but because of what it does to generic competition. The biggest way to bring down prices in any market is to increase the competition, right? Increase that innovation there. Generics have been phenomenally successful in this. For one example, with AIDS medicines, the price went down from around $15,000 per patient per year for a course of antiretrovirals to $62 per patient per year. That was over, got a couple minutes, that was over about a 1 year period after generic competition was introduced. So the question then is, will the TPP impede Pharmac's ability to get generic medicines? Now, Tim Grosser and John Key are saying no, it won't. They're saying, no, that's our bottom line, and we're protecting Pharmac in there. I know from the past agreements that there should be some interest in here about generics, but nowhere in it does it say generics are illegal or we're going to ban generics or anything like that, because it doesn't. In fact, it says that we are going to affirm the Doha Declaration on Public Health, which allows for compulsory licensing of generics. I think with the TPP, though, the devil's in the detail. And what there is, rather than a blanket disavowal of generics, there's several other technical measures which make it much harder to access generic medicines. One of these is data exclusivity, where the data itself is protected for a period longer than it needs to be, which makes it very hard for generics companies to have the knowledge to develop copies of drugs. Another one is called evergreening, which just allows for more patents, multiple patents on the same product. Another one is marketing approval, patent linkage. These various little clauses which all don't disallow generics, they just make it much harder to get them. What does this do? It means it's much harder for Pharmac to actually use that as a viable threat. to say, well, we won't pay for this brand name drug, we'll just get these generics. That's not a very meaningful threat if they have to jump through numerous loops to actually get them. But that's a way you could say, no, Pharmac's still there and we're not impeding compulsory licenses with its powers much reduced. That's one cause for concern. Another cause for concern is the investor-state dispute settlement that Fraser mentioned, where companies may sue the government. This is a concern for me because Big Pharma has proven themselves over the years to be quite willing and ready to sue governments when they feel their patents are being breached. For example, 1998, they sued Nelson Mandela for trying to import cheaper generic copies of drugs for AIDS patients in South Africa. So if this big pharma companies are willing to sue Madiba, rest in peace, I don't think they're going to stop at lesser symbolically moral challenges. And finally, one other I'm concerned about, and I'll just briefly mention this idea of putting a member of a big pharmaceutical representative on the Pharmac board is one of the other plans of the TPP. Now this is a tricky one because on the one hand it may have little impact, which as we've seen in Australia, it's unclear whether it's influenced things too much. They've done a similar thing in Australia, pharmaceutical benefit scheme. On the other hand, it does seem to be very much putting a wolf in the hen house in terms of the agenda to increase patent protection and reduce generics versus the agenda to find the cheapest medicines available. Either way, putting someone on that panel exhibits another aspect of the TPP, which is that it's about much more than just IP and about much more than trade, and that it's actually reaching into domestic policy making, domestic governance boards, and influencing how that happens. Which is a good thing to remember, that this deal goes further than any other trade agreement we've ever seen in terms of the way it influences domestic policy making. But to end on a slightly more positive note, if some of this has been a bit alarming, it's important to remember that one of the reasons that the TPP exists is because people indeed use that transparency and use their democratic voice to challenge what was happening and to deny Big Pharma's monopolist powers at the WTO. That's why they had to leave the WTO and explore bilateral agreements. And the reason Big Pharma were even at the WTO was because they had people, democratically organised people, had used their powers to deny Big Pharma's monopolist agenda at the UN. So, given that we're now at the cusp of a potential TRIPS Plus regional free trade deal, my suggestion is that we may want to use our democratic powers once again to deny Big Pharma's monopolist agenda at the TPP. And this is our moment to do it, so thank you all for coming along and sharing an interest in that.
It's a huge political commitment by the United States and by New Zealand, because New Zealand politicians have business for a long time have been trying to get a free trade agreement with the United States. It shouldn't be seen, however, simply as this gigantic sort of cooperation agreement around the Pacific, because it is part of the tensions between the United States and China. Therefore, geopolitical implications of it. The United States, and you'll see I'll point out some of the aspects of it. There are aspects of it that China would never find acceptable. So in a way, it's also the United States trying to constrain China's growing influence in this part of the world. China, on the other hand, has, with a number of other countries, initiated, if you like, a competing agreement, which New Zealand always start with such agreements, is also part of the negotiations for the so-called Regional Closer Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP. So there's these two, if you like, competing blocks, and they have quite significantly different philosophies as to how they will construct them. This one is very much along the lines that Thomas talked about, and is very intrusive into domestic policy. So just to talk a little bit about the process first. It's negotiated in secret. Minister of Trade Tim Grosser has said New Zealand would never release texts without the agreement of our negotiating partners, end of story, and the negotiating partners all say the same thing, so no one is willing to break ranks and show us the text. Just how you can comment intelligently on an agreement without knowing the text is of course very difficult, which means that the negotiators can hold that over you at any time when you make a comment. And I talk to you, and so what we have to do is to guess to some extent what is in the agreement from leaks, and there have been a few in intellectual property and investment. There was one recently just last week that gave a greater overview of the agreement. And you can pick up a little from talking to negotiators, but very little. And we know a bit also from the models that the United States uses in other agreements. So you can guess from that just where it is heading. Internally in New Zealand, domestically, it's also important to know what the process is for ratifying, for signing New Zealand up finally to make these agreements binding on New Zealand. And there was a lot of misleading comments that have been made by business representatives and even by ministers of the Crown about this. It is, in New Zealand, the legal situation is that Cabinet, or actually the Executive, which is pretty similar to Cabinet, pretty well to Cabinet, has the full power to ratify these agreements. Parliament doesn't ratify agreements. Cabinet presents a signed treaty. So the negotiators come to a conclusion. After long negotiations, they sign off what is in a legal sense a draft agreement, but in practice, in a political sense, it's the final agreement. And they sign it off. Cabinet then presents the signed treaty to Parliament as simply a matter of process. They give Parliament 15 sitting days, which is approximately 5 weeks, to consider it. Now, the Cabinet can actually ratify that agreement at any time during these 5 weeks. It has the power to do it, and in fact did so with another agreement that New Zealand is now party to with Thailand. Parliament sends it to a select committee, which generally gives around 20 days for the public to make submissions. Now just think about this. These agreements are intensely complex, and Thomas has talked about the intellectual property one. Very difficult for any ordinary mortal to understand. That's only one small part. There are 29 chapters in this agreement. It's kind of a couple of telephone books in size. To understand it, you actually have to know not only the whole agreement, but all the precedents, the understanding of how what the wording really means in a legal sense. So it's not something you can absorb in 20 days. In any case, the Select Committee has no power to change it. It can make comment on it, but has no power to change it. The Cabinet can still say, you may say that, but we're going to go ahead and ratify. The only power that Parliament has is if any legislation is required to put it into practice in New Zealand. And for some of these agreements, no legislation is required. Sometimes legislation is required to change our tariffs, the taxes that we charge on imports. But in this case, there will be very little of that. There may be other parts of it, perhaps in intellectual property, that require legislation, but there'll be large parts of it, such as the workings of Farm Act, that may not need legislation at all, may just be able to be done by regulation or just by Cabinet instructions. So in practice, so even if the Parliament had a vote on it, in any case, Cabinet generally has a majority of Parliament, but actually that power is solely with Cabinet to make that process. It's a process that goes back to the monarchs of England who reserve the power to make treaties over and above Parliament in England. Just to give you an idea of the confusion and the misleading statements that are being made even by ministers responsible for this. Stephen Joyce was acting Minister of Trade in the last few weeks while Tim Gross was overseas negotiating on this and various other things. Green MP asked him a question in Parliament on the 10th of December, just a few days ago, and Stephen Joyce replied, I think the member misunderstands the process that these things go through. She suggests that Cabinet will ratify the agreement. Cabinet that will not. In fact, Parliament ratifies the agreement. Next day, the 11th of December, Russell Norman asked the Minister whether he stood by his statement yesterday. The Minister prevaricated a little, but then admitted that he perhaps was on the wrong track. Russell Norman said, so when Stephen Joyce told the House yesterday that Parliament ratifies the treaty, not Cabinet, Stephen Joyce was absolutely wrong. Stephen Joyce said, it's fair to say that Mr Joyce got it wrong yesterday. It's quite an amusing exchange there. If you would like to look it up on the web, basically Stephen Joyce was caught out misleading Parliament about the process of ratification.
The interesting one is he refers to himself in the third party.
If you read the exchange, you'll see why. He's referring to himself as acting Minister of Trade rather than his current position as whatever he was, Minister of Commerce or something. But it's quite an amusing exchange, but in the end he said, I was wrong. It is ratified by Cabinet. So what is actually in the TPPA? Well, the first thing to remember is we talk loosely about it as the free trade agreement, but it's not actually mainly about trade. Most of our tariffs have gone, so there's not a great deal more to argue about there in terms of trade, or trade in goods, and that's true for many of the countries because there are existing free trade agreements between the United States and most of these other countries. When Australia negotiated a free trade agreement with the United States in the mid-2000s, its exporters were highly disappointed at the access they got to the US market, which was a big thing for our dairy and meat exporters. Their exporters got no access for sugar. That's something that still rankles, and a big issue for them in these negotiations. Beef, dairy, lamb and wine access were delayed for 12 to 17 years. So you can guess what happens if we do get any access for dairy. US farm subsidies are still there. And the United States continues to resist any further concessions for Australia in the TPPA negotiations. So the first chief negotiator for New Zealand in TPPA has been replaced by another one since then, said in a conversation with the United States that's been leaked through WikiLeaks, there is a public perception a US free trade agreement will be an El Dorado for New Zealand's commercial sector, but reality is different. New Zealand must manage expectations about the benefits of such agreement. And anything we get, we will have to pay for in other ways. How will we have to pay? Well, here are some of the other areas of the agreement, which I'll go through briefly, that will be accepted in payment. State-owned enterprises, health, investment, intellectual property, the services area, financial services, temporary entry for work purposes, various forms of regulation, constraining that, transparency, meaning transparency for the transnationals, government procurement, quarantine, food labelling, labour environment, competition disputes, and the list goes on. So I'll give you some examples. Just to start on agriculture. So the US dairy lobby is strongly resisting any access by New Zealand and is attacking Fonterra, describing it as a state monopoly with government subsidies, which is all actually inaccurate, but they will try and break down Fonterra as a quid pro quo for further access. In Japan, which only recently entered the negotiations, it's named 5 so-called untouchable agricultural products that it will not allow any entry to. They are dairy, rice, wheat, beef and pork, and sugar. And the government there is adamant, but there is huge public opposition to any entry of those products. Absolutely huge politically. And even if we get access, well, firstly, there's the question how much more our environment can stand the further intensification of dairy, and that's obviously something that there's long debate over, but there's a question we have to ask. But there's also these other aspects that Professor Keith Woodward, who's Professor of Agribusiness and Farm Management at Lincoln University, just outside Christchurch, has pointed out just a month ago. He said, it's often argued that New Zealand needs the TPP so that it can gain access to the US dairy market. Less than 5 years ago, this may have made sense, but the world has moved on. The US is now the world's second largest exporter of dairy products, no longer matters what rules the TPP comes up with. The reality is that the US has very limited potential for New Zealand's dairy products. New Zealand should be particularly wary of offering concessions in other fields such as pharmaceuticals or other intellectual property in return for such limited benefits. So really, the price for this kind of Eldorado of excess of dairy and meat and so on to the US market is likely to be worth far less than it's commonly made out. So in the area of health, Thomas has talked about the pharmaceutical area, and I won't go into that in any more detail, but there's actually a whole lot of other areas in the agreement where health is affected. And I'll just scoot over them here, but I'll pick them up again in other ways later on. So it's actually one of the areas where there's very substantial potential major costs, both socially and financially, to New Zealand and to other members of the TPPA. So Pharmac, Thomas has talked about, and that's not simply about somehow dismantling Pharmac, but about the way it works, and I think Thomas has gone through that. Just remember too that Pharmac has had its competency, if you like, expanded to cover medical devices, to try and push down the price of medical devices. Those companies who are selling those will try to do exactly the same thing with those as pharmaceuticals. Public health, this is things like anti-smoking campaigns, alcohol labelling and so on. You may be aware that Australia has a plain packaging rule to try to dissuade people from smoking, and there's an example of one of its packages there to make it more attractive to you to smoke. It's been challenged by the tobacco companies under rules that the TPPA will bring in for New Zealand unless there are strong antidotes to it. So, and I'll come to those later on. There are other rules that make it more difficult for us to bring in those kinds of public health rules. Blood could be treated as a commercial service and therefore make it more difficult for us to have our not-for-profit supply of blood for medical purposes. Might force us to take imports and various other things. They want patenting of surgical methods, so a surgeon could patent the way that they do an operation, making it less available or more expensive to other surgeons to use new methods of surgery. It could affect ACC because it's a state-owned enterprise and because it could be seen as a competitor to commercial insurance companies. They could try to force it to open to private competition, therefore destroying the kind of whole way it works. This area has led to substantial opposition and concern from a range of organisations both in New Zealand, such as the Public Health Association, Smoke Free Aotearoa, the New Zealand Nurses Organisation, Global Aspen Network, and internationally from a whole lot of organisations including Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and many others concerned about a wide range of aspects. State-owned enterprises is another novel aspect of this agreement. The US has has aspects of this in the trade agreement with Singapore, but it really wants to suit this up. It's actually aimed primarily at China, because China, as you know, a lot of its companies that act overseas are state-owned enterprises, and the United States thinks, and probably with some justification, that many of them effectively have state support and therefore don't act competitively. That may or may not be true. But we are likely to be collateral damage in these kinds of rules. It's a critical issue for the United States, and there's very loud noises from business and labour interests in the United States to have rules that clamp down on what state-owned enterprises can do. Now, the definition of state-owned enterprise, don't take that literally as meaning things like Genesis Energy and Meridian. It could, what it means is still not clear. It could mean any part of government that acts in competition with a commercial in a commercial market with a United States corporation, or Japanese corporation or whatever from the TPPA country. It would force these, I call them SOEs, but remember that distinction, force them to act solely in accordance with commercial considerations where they compete with these transnationals. So they could have no non-commercial goals, they couldn't have government funding, or they couldn't have directions from government that are inconsistent with the TPPA rules. So, for example, they would prevent state-owned enterprises from pursuing social goals like low-cost electricity for every household, which has been one suggestion, or continuing daily mail deliveries. They could prevent them, like Kiwi Rail, having build it here policies for rail wagons. It could prevent them favouring local suppliers. It could prevent them running at a low profit so that the price to you and me is low. It could prevent the establishment of new central and local government, state-owned enterprises or local enterprises, and providers of social services such as in housing. It could apply to not only SOEs but to ACC, to farming, to Zespri, public broadcasting, postal services, a whole range of different government services. And also to local government services, areas like water, electricity, network companies, ports and so on. The United States will, in its usual way, be requiring exemptions for its own SOEs. But as I said before, it's not clear just exactly what these will be covering and what the impact will be. Negotiators are reportedly still trying to discover from the United States just what it means by all this. Investment and finance is another area. It reduces our ability to control risky financial products, which led to, some of which led to the global financial crisis. It would make dealing with financial crises much more difficult. The impact of those, as you know, inevitably ends up on the poor. So it's it ends up benefiting those financial institutions. It would reduce our ability to control overseas investment in New Zealand. The investor-state dispute settlement, this is if a dispute occurs, this is the way that the agreement says it will be settled. What it is the right for individual investors to sue governments. And this occurs not in our courts, but in international tribunals of lawyers who have worked in this area of dispute resolution, and many of them have represented, they sit on these panels, but at other times they may have represented some of these countries or these companies. So the degree of partiality is always a big issue here. So rather than, if a dispute occurs, rather than that happening in our courts, which is the usual thing, it could be taken to one of these very remote, highly expensive, to have them to settle in those tribunals. Up to now, Australia has said no quite firmly, and its Productivity Commission told the Australian government, these are just not worth getting into, the risks are high, the benefits are not identifiable. New Zealand appears to accept that it should be in these. The new Australian government seems to be willing to negotiate on these as a quid pro quo for getting other things it wants. There are current cases where Philip Morris Tobacco is suing both Uruguay and Australia over their tobacco control laws. So far, something like $326 million has been awarded against the three countries of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, United States, Canada and Mexico. Most of these have been about environmental rules in those countries. One example is that $15.6 million was awarded against Mexico to a United States company called Metalclad when a local government, a provincial government there closed down a toxic waste dump that was polluting the water supplies of the local community. Argentina has had $430 million plus interest awarded against it for actions it took during its financial crisis in the early 2000s. The majority of these cases are about environmental controls, as I said, but they're also against failed privatisations, financial crisis measures, and there have even been some cases, one in South Africa, for example, on human rights and labour issues. This is a crunch issue for the huge music, video, movie corporations in the United States. So they kind of companioned, riding side by side with the pharmaceutical companies, and the kind of positions that they've taken have been quite radical. They've taken positions that have been voted down after huge public campaigns in the United States, and there's a strong suspicion in the United States amongst the users of the internet and these kinds of products that this is a backdoor way to get from these companies to get what they couldn't get through legislation in the United States. New Zealand has taken quite an enlightened position on this. It recognises that we're importers of intellectual property rather than exporters, net importers rather than exporters, and therefore we have an interest in having weaker intellectual property rules. However, the question is how much the government will allow them to stick to that in the negotiations. And here are just some of the examples from one of the organisations working on these issues. So it's about if you copy things off the internet, or if what ISPs have to do if one of these companies say someone has been illegally downloading things, and so on. These are big issues both in New Zealand but also the United States and other countries. Here we have the Fair Deal campaign, which is largely focused on intellectual property rules, which includes the Royal New Zealand Foundation of the Blind, the Libraries Association, Consumer New Zealand, and some New Zealand and international information technology, software and internet organisations, and firms such as Trade Me and Institute of IT Professionals. So these are people all very concerned about the directions that these intellectual property rules are taking. Government procurement is a very controversial one, but one that's not so commonly debated. Government procurement is a very useful tool for economic development. Governments, by giving preference to local firms, can help them develop, to sell their products, grow in size, and therefore become able to survive, but also to export. But the TPPA rules would prevent any kind of local preference. Many local governments have rules that either give a price preference or some other kind of preference to local suppliers. It will prevent anything other than commercial conditions on the suppliers themselves that are above legal minimum. So conditions such as that they pay a living wage, which isn't a legal standard, but it's a standard that many community organisations support, would not be allowed. Higher health and safety standards than the legal minimum is another example. Higher energy efficiency or other environmental standards, such as Greater Wellington Council has, would not be allowed. It prevents boycotts of goods from other countries, such as many people and organisations carried out against apartheid South Africa. It's likely to apply to local government. This is a matter for the government to decide in terms of its office in these agreements, but a leak that occurred last week appears to indicate that will apply to local government as well as central government. It's not clear either which agencies of government it will apply to. And the government is signing a similar agreement in the WTO. Okay, there's a lot more here. This is about the ability of these companies to influence the way laws and rules are made, their ability to demand reviews, to have a say, to be consulted. There's provisions on quarantine requirements for food and so on coming into New Zealand. GM regulations are a big target of the United States for obvious reasons. Issues around labelling. The services area would prevent us. We've already signed up to some of these commitments in the World Trade Organization. And for example, the reason you don't see a great deal of local content on radio and TV is that we've signed up against being able to give any preference to local content. There'll be demands that we extend those commitments, and perhaps the most sensitive area here is in financial services. Again, we've signed up to some commitments in the WTO, but this would extend these even further. They make it more difficult to restrict high-risk new so-called financial products. Again, I'm talking about these ones that triggers for the global financial crisis. Will make it more difficult for us to control overseas borrowing and currency trading, the kind of things that play havoc with our exchange rate. In short, they learns nothing from the global financial crisis. These ones I think I'll just skip over. I've alluded to the quite remarkable group of organisations that have shown concern about intellectual property, but there's a wide group of other organisations here that have come out with concerns about where it is heading. There was a jurist leader, prominent lawyers, former legislators, even judges against this investor state dispute settlement, ISDS provision. Health specialists just recently sent a letter to the Ministry of Health over these health issues, and many other organisations in the health area, environmental groups such as Greenpeace and Sierra Club, and many local ones as well, unions in New Zealand and internationally, journalists and commentators such as Rod Oram and Bernard Hickey, and even some editorials and some quite conservative daily papers have come out showing concern, particularly at secrecy. The opposition political parties, one to one degree or another, are now showing opposition to the directions and particularly the secrecy about it. So Labour withhold support until full details are made available, and there's clear evidence that the agreement is in the best interest of New Zealand, which is a substantial move for Labour, having been the initiator of this in the first place. Greens, New Zealand First and MANA are quite clearly opposed to it. And we have resolutions from Auckland, Nelson and Greater Wellington councils that show concern for local government.
There's also one in front of the Palmerston North City Council and Horizons District Council at the present time.
I think this is one area that you can take action locally, to persuade your local councils to speak out about this. Here's some URLs for further information. I'll make this PowerPoint available so you can access this at your leisure. That's that. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou everybody. It's a great initiative for Palmerston North. Thanks to Sue and all the others who have been organising this. It's very timely. What I want to talk about today and follow up to the other speakers are three things. First, the lead up to the recent ministerial meeting in Singapore. Secondly, what happened at that meeting and what some of the implications are of the decisions that we understand were made. And thirdly, what happens next, so far as we know, in this highly secretive process. Before the ministerial meeting in early December in Singapore, there had been a quite intense period of activity. In the middle of this year, the ministers decided that they were going to set a deadline for the end of 2013 to conclude the agreement. Now, everybody was sceptical about that because, firstly, they'd had deadlines before in this now 3-year negotiation and hadn't met them. They were also sceptical because the state of some of the chapters was in considerable disarray. Some of them, such as the intellectual property chapter, was shown by the leak from WikiLeaks last month to have been in August in a state of major disagreement between the US and virtually all of the other countries. And the intellectual property chapter, because it covers both the digital domain, which is a high value area for Hollywood and other content providers, but also is the potential pathway for future services and money and goods delivery globally of crucial importance to the US. The IP chapter, of course, also covers pharmaceuticals alongside the transparency annex, as it's quaintly called, that deals with the processes around entities like Pharmac. So we knew that that was stuck. It was confirmed by that leak. Another area that was stuck was the environment chapter, where there have been strong positions regarding the enforceability or otherwise of whatever the rules are there, and disputes over which of the environmental agreements will be covered. Not simply a dispute between the ASEAN countries on the one hand and the OECD countries on the other, to put it in a sort of richer, poorer West Asian dichotomy, but also because the US has not signed all of these agreements. A third chapter that was really stuck because there isn't any agreed text, because it's actually a quite novel chapter, is the chapter on state-owned enterprises. That's the chapter that I work predominantly around, and there weren't even agreed definitions of what a state enterprise was. And so we were, leading up to the round that they had in Salt Lake City in November, very sceptical about the end-of-year deadline. But it also became very clear in Salt Lake City that the officials were working under very strict riding instructions. They are officials, so they have to work to the mandate that's given to them by their ministers, and that meant that they had to do their utmost to be able to conclude the chapters to the point of political decision-making by December. At Salt Lake City, where there was no pretense even of any stakeholder activity, but we were hanging around the fringes anyway, the officials were under much more visibly intense pressure than they had been before. And I put out a press release at the time that was based on discussions with a number of countries' negotiators about bullying taking place by the US within the intellectual property chapter. Our negotiators say that wasn't the case, but a subsequent leak of internal discussions from one country, we don't know which, reinforced the view that there had been inordinate pressure from the US in proposing its text and in not allowing the counter texts from a number of other countries, including New Zealand, to be properly considered in the discussions. And there'd also been a lot of pressure on other areas. In addition, the crunch point probably for the negotiations, which governments are going to use for deciding what trade-offs they'll make, the access to each other's markets for goods and agriculture, had not advanced. And this leaked paper that was put up on WikiLeaks in December, the internal paper from one of the countries, also confirmed that the US was playing hardball on access to its markets in refusing to put anything seriously on the table until it had seen what the others were doing on the things of interest to the US. And once, of course, you show your hand, it's very hard to back off, so that worked to the US advantage. So by the end of Salt Lake City, those of us who'd been there came away very clear that there was an intention to wind this up as far as possible by the end of the year, and that this wasn't going to be just another missed deadline. It took a little bit of convincing of people who weren't there that what rationally shouldn't be able to happen, that it was a mess, that there were things that were subject to major disagreement, that there was nothing in this for countries other than the US. Everyone said, well, why would anyone do a deal? We said, well, that's actually the sense of Salt Lake City. In addition, people were saying, why would any government in their right mind make a deal when they can't guarantee that the US will deliver on anything that they promise? And it became clear during the Salt Lake City round in November that the US Congress was not going to grant President Obama what's known as fast-track authority or trade promotion authority. That means the Congress would have to either accept or reject the deal as a whole and not be able to pick it apart. It also meant that there would be a time limitation on the discussion in the Congress, so they couldn't filibuster it so that the debate could go on forever and ever and ever. President Obama does not have fast-track authority at present, and there are sufficiently contentious matters in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement for Congress to want to pick it apart, whether it's on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry or the mining industry or the tobacco industry, or from traditional Democrat supporters in areas such as environment and labour policies, and of course their farmers. So when we were asking people in Salt Lake City, why do you think the ministers will consider this without fast track? They said, well, because we don't think that Congress ultimately will deny him fast track if he signs a deal. The Republicans may have appeared to be strong-arming Obama over the budget issues there a couple of months ago, but they lost political credibility, and if they were seen to block a deal of this sort, then it would not work well for them. So the ministers were prepared to gamble that if they made concessions, then the US would be able to put a deal before the Congress that it could sell. And it could get fast track, or it could get it through the Congress without fast track. So we came away from Salt Lake City quite depressed and sensed the message around that the ministerial meeting in Singapore was going to be deadly serious. The meeting itself was held immediately after the WTO ministerial meeting in Bali, and we know now that there was a lot of preliminary work done in Bali with the ministers and with some of the chief negotiators. I happened to stumble across the New Zealand chief and deputy chief negotiators having lunch with the chief US negotiator, going through a pile of her papers, and it was clear that they were working out the strategy for how they deal with things in Singapore. Once we got to Singapore, where again, of course, there was no stakeholder process, there were media who'd been invited to register, but they weren't told when anything was happening, and in fact nothing happened for them until the final day. We got a very clear sense that the ministers were serious. And the first indication we had of how they were going to try to railroad this through was that they had split up the ministers into groups of 4. That's the 12 countries had been split into groups of 4, and those 4 could have one official each, and they would sit around the table and try to broker an outcome that would be put to the plenary of the ministers as a compromise deal. The rest of the countries could sit in the background and take notes, but they couldn't speak. Now, in the crucial intellectual property group, the 4 were Canada, the US, and Mexico, plus Vietnam, which meant that New Zealand and Chile, for example, who had been the strongest opponents to the US proposals on intellectual property, weren't at the table. This is a process they use in the WTO called the green room process, which is designed basically to marginalise dissident voices and push things through. Now that process trundled along for a couple of days, and we were picking up some pretty disturbing messages about the kind of concessions that were being made. Then there was a bit of a bombshell, which was a leak that came out. That was the paper I've referred to earlier. That was an internal document from one of the parties, which was talking about US pressure, US railroading, and a series of issues around the negotiations. So it was clear that there were already some unhappy campers before the ministerial meeting. But at the ministerial meeting, no one was actually prepared to talk about anything to outsiders. There was a second document, which is a chart, and I invite you to go onto WikiLeaks to have a look at this, because it's that country's assessment of where all the other countries are on a whole range of issues. And it showed, again, that the US was being very aggressive or very defensive of its particular interess, without a lot of support from other countries on key issues. So when they come out at the end of a meeting and say that they have made very significant progress, and that progress is such that it has to be able to get through the US Congress, you can make assessments that those concessions are predominantly in the US favour. And that was what we found from a report in the Washington Trade Daily that said on the intellectual property area, there had been a concession by all of the countries except one to work within the US framework. And that effectively meant giving away positions that had been hard held for the last 3 years, including by New Zealand and Chile, because we know that the holdout country was a developing country. Now, whether that is absolutely accurate or not, we don't know, because it's, of course, all secret. But what we did find out as a result of media discussion back here after that was that Tim Grosser conceded two things on Farm Act. One was that there would be some changes to Farm Act. He very carefully worded it that New Zealanders would not be required to pay more for their medicines than at present. Now, that sounds really reassuring, but it's not. What it means is that New Zealanders, when they go and buy their meds at the chemists, will not have to pay more. But it, we think, means that the pharmaceutical companies will get a larger share of the Farm Act budget, which means Farm Act will be able to subsidise fewer medicines. That is assuming the government doesn't use taxpayer money, which is patients paying indirectly, to up the budget of Farm Act. So either Farm Act gets more money and more of that goes to the drug companies, or Farm Act pays a larger share to the drug companies and there are fewer subsidised medicines. Grosser has always said the fundamentals of Farm Act will be protected, and I'm sure he would claim that that kind of deal still protects the fundamentals. The second thing that he conceded was that this quaintly called transparency annex on healthcare technologies may require some changes to our processes for Farm Act. Now, he put that in terms of compliance costs. But what that annex actually means is that the pharmaceutical companies would have more influence over Farm Act's decisions, and that they would be able to exercise more leverage to be able to get Farm Act to give them the subsidies or the approvals by the agency that does the approvals of drugs. And that's a second way to be able to white ant the effectiveness of Farm Act. There were other areas that we understand were agreed, but we don't know precisely. Now, Tim Grosser again said that no decisions were made in Singapore. It's quite wrong to say any decisions were made. Technically. Now, technically, that's correct, because in these negotiations, they say nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And so they have signalled, or they have indicated, and the officials now will be working within those indications, what the landing zones, as they refer to them, will be for various chapters. That means that basically we have given way, and we have given way, we know, without the US putting anything effectively on the table in relation to the holy grail of access to the dairy markets in the US. Which is a whole other story, and I suspect Bill Rosenberg may have dealt with that. So they have started to make deals in really crucial areas, without fast-track authority from the US Congress, and without the US making any quid pro quo in relation to its dairy markets, even if that was of significant value to us. So what happens next? Well, they, according to Grosser, the chief negotiators from each of the countries will now be working fast and furious between now and when the ministers meet next, which will be around the fringes of the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos in late January. Now, anyone who knows about the World Economic Forum meeting will know that it's where the major corporate lobbyists do their thing with the political leaders, and it is about as tight an exercise in corporate control as you can get. We think that the meeting, in fact, will be after that in London, and the ministers will be there aiming to pull off more deal-making before they enter into the last phases, which they hope will involve a meeting in April on the side of the APEC trade ministers meeting, and then Obama is going to be doing a tiki tour of the Asia-Pacific region where he can sign a final deal in April. That means the pressure is really intense. Right? Don't believe anyone who says this is just too complicated and it will never happen. There are some important political questions, which is the point I'll finish on. There has now been a lot of polling, and there has been letters demanding the release of the text. There have been public press conferences from the 5 main political parties that have said we require the text to be released. There have been the most recent poll from Avars reinforced some polling that we did back in December, which, excuse me, referring to my notes, said 70% of New Zealanders oppose a deal that would tighten up the use of generic medicines. 56% would oppose the companies, the foreign investors' right to sue, and only 25% support it. 71% oppose the secrecy, and only 10% agree that the agreement should be kept secret until the deal is done. And so we need to put the pressure on to release the text before it's signed, to have a proper analysis that we can do and a proper debate during an election year, and we need to have, in particular, Labour come off the fence and actually take a position that is consistent with the policies it's going to be going to the electorate with, and stand alongside those parties, the Greens, New Zealand First, Mana, and now the Māori Party, in saying this deal is not good for Aotearoa New Zealand. Kia ora koutou.